thanks for joining us on the final installment of the investment support webinar series. Today we're talking about impact and how to keep the main thing the main thing. Right now I'm just going to hand over to Josh and Chloe. They sit within Big Issue Invest. They can introduce themselves and then get into the talk. So thank you guys for coming and thank you for offering your time. I know right now it's super valuable because everybody wants a piece of you, but today I've got you for 45 minutes. So please get us started.
Thanks, Ekla. I'll just quickly introduce myself. So I'm Josh. I'm the head of impact with Big Issue Invest. So I work across Big Issue Invest, helping the organization to develop an impact framework for all of our work with investees, everything from our early stage work with Hecla through to some of our larger fund management deals, which is where Chloe sits. So I'll stop now and I'll let Chloe introduce herself.
Hi, thanks Josh. I'm Chloe. I am an impact analyst working with Josh across Big Issue Invest. I mainly specialise with fund management, which is our outcomes investment fund and our social enterprise investment fund, supporting investees, similar to Josh.
So what I'm going to do, everyone, is I'm going to share my screen so that we can talk through a bit of our the kind of impact framework and some of the tools that we recommend people consider. So it means that I can't see faces. So if you have any questions, do just unmute yourself and shout, and I'll also try and check the chat periodically. So what we're going to go through today is a kind of an overview of what we do in our impact management approaches. We'll give you some frameworks and some tools to develop some ideas of what you might want to do to think about the different ways you can capture the impact of your organization. And we'll also hopefully help give some ideas of what you can be looking to do after COVID, because obviously right now we might be slightly limited in the type of data collection we want to do as organizations, particularly with the amount of time we get with our users, customers and beneficiaries is incredibly precious. All the stuff which is in this presentation you'll have access to afterwards, so don't worry too much about taking notes from what's on the screen. So just to kick us off, I'm going to hide that. Our overall sort of mission statement is to make sure we have a world that works for everyone. We want to keep admitting people as we go. We want to sort of challenge and innovate to help to to dismantle poverty now for future generations. And this is actually quite a new point for us for future generations, as Big Issue is footing the bill currently going through Parliament. So to do that, we want to make sure that we put our money into the places where it matters the most. So you can see in the attachment, we've got a kind of rough overview of where we're investing our money across the UK. And we use an index of multiple deprivation as quite a helpful starter kit for finding out whether or not our money is going to the right place to solve some of the sort of social inequalities and injustices we have in the UK. I'll stop there and I'll let Chloe talk a little bit around the overall framework, and we'll come back to some of these tools that we use for tracking this kind of work.
Cool, thanks Josh. So this is our impact framework at Big Issue Invest. It's kind of how we choose what we choose to gather, why we choose to gather it, and what's valuable for our overall impact aims as an organisation. So initially we know we have to start off by looking at what activities we do and what the investee experience is and how that helps us to understand the contribution to the outcomes, the overall social investee and market outcomes that we aim to achieve. When we look at the investee and social outcomes, we look at those with the investee organisation kind of in partnership together to kind of see what's relevant to the organisations that we're investing in. So what business aims, what financial aims they're looking over the investment period to achieve, and then what social outcomes they want to achieve. So we set those targets together right at the beginning so we can measure what's most valuable. And then we also assess our contribution in that partnership. So obviously the BI attribution isn't the full reach of the social outcomes and targets. So yeah, we assess that right from the beginning as well. And when it comes to kind of the market outcomes, that's more of a sector approach that we take. So we look at how overall in the market we might have had an impact, whether that be with shared learnings to grow the sector, kind of contributing to investee learning with each other, and then just generally providing risk capital to the social enterprise sector in the market to kind of stimulate growth. It's kind of wider market outcomes. And we'll revisit this kind of overall framework later on in the presentation to kind of give you more of how this can be adapted to any other social enterprise. But yeah, it's just worth noting that this is broadly how we look at our impact. So we look at our activities, then we look at how it impacts on the investee, then we look at the investee outcomes and social outcomes and any wider outcomes in the market. Josh, do you want to move on?
Yep.
Cool. So this is an example of how we measure our investee experience, because that's a really important thing for us. So we look at, this is a survey that we send out post-investment to kind of review with our investees how they found the whole experience. So we'll look at things like the suitability of our investment, the interest rates, the terms, and how they've kind of found the overall investment process. And from that, we'll get a NPS rating. So that's a net promoter score, which again, we'll go into later on in the presentation. But it's kind of quite a straightforward way for us to gather information really quickly to see whether our product is suitable for investees and whether there's any way that we can improve that offering. Next.
And just to sort of take Chloe's point, so obviously we've shown you an overview of how Big Issue Invest think about our impact framework. And one of the key things that we find is often missing when people think about impact, which is essentially how well your services work for your beneficiary group. There are loads of other ways that you can look at this and build a theory of change or an impact framework. So Chloe and I just kind of chucked in 2 examples of what we think is quite a thorough theory of change. This is done by Proper Job Theatre, who theatre based in north of England, who provide a series of kind of arts-based interventions to support people who are long-term unemployed and help them improve their well-being and overall their employability outcomes. And they've got quite a complex set of what we call kind of pathways, which are these arrows, which explain why they think what they do helps to achieve overall the ability for someone to become more employable in a sustainable way. It can look quite complicated, or you can keep it quite simple. This is Redemption Roasters, who had some support from Unlimited at the time to develop a rough impact framework where they said essentially, this is what we do, this is the goods and services, these are the outcomes we want to see in and out of the prison with the young people that we're working with, and this is the overall impact that Redemption Roasters wants to have on society. So just to kind of reiterate this point, we want to make sure that for you it's clear that we're showing you our way of framing this. If you have questions as we go along, we can say how this relates to other framings you might have seen. And also, we can talk about ideas you have that you might want to build up in your own way. So what I'll do is I'll keep going. I'm just going to quickly open up the grid view to see if anyone's jumping up and down to give us but I'll assume we're all okay. So I'll keep going. So what we've kind of recommended is, for what we recommend sort of to investees and people we work with, is to have a kind of overall theory of change which helps you to think about the different types of data you need to talk about your organization. So we showed you about Big Issue Invest one. What we've done for this exercise is to kind of put together what we think could be quite helpful for you. I'll talk through this, and then Chloe and I will go into kind of more detail onto each of these different categories of activity, access, experience, and social outcomes. But overall, what we want to show here is it's good for you to start thinking about structuring not just the data you're collecting from beneficiaries, but also to really understand your own business. Because often funders and stakeholders and collaborators are keen to know about yourselves, keen to know the work you do and how you are as an employer. So for that, we've talked about your activity report. So what do you do to make the work you deliver happen? Who is accessing that work? So we call that the customer access. What are the characteristics? Where are they? What's the customer experience? As Chloe talked to, kind of net promoter score and other questions. The social outcomes, you can kind of go down a rabbit hole with this, and we'll talk about those rabbit holes later on. But then also your enterprise health. So understanding the characteristics of your enterprise that you might want to talk to.
I got a quick question, Josh.
Go for it, Hecla.
Helpful for some people here today. How relevant is the net promoter score still? Because a lot of people that will, I don't know, online, they like to promote everyone.
So obviously the Net Promoter Score is a tricky metric, which some people will say is completely overused, and I just think can be quite biased because you have it shoved down your throat so often that
It's like the
people will
mantra.
just click 10.
People already like you and they want to respond
Yes, exactly.
in front of them.
So
Right?
so on the flip side of that, the benefit is that it's one of the scores that almost every single enterprise will find a comparative score that they can showcase.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, obviously, as an investor, we can compare ourselves to kind of wider banking sector and specialist banking sector. So sometimes it's quite a useful way to differentiate yourself in the market, even if just from a starter.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say if you try and use the NPS alone to understand whether your service works, it
Mm-hmm.
probably won't be helpful. It's more about a kind of where do you place in the wider sector.
Yeah, one cog in the wheel. We got another question. What is the 60 decibel style customer listening?
It's a very good question. So I'll come to it later on. It's one of the links, but 60 decibels was set up as an offshoot of Acumen, who are kind of specialist monitoring and evaluation consultants.
Mm-hmm.
So 60 decibels is, to give the name, it's meant to be the volume that people talk at. I've got a feeling I'm probably closer to 65 or 70, sadly. But what it's meant to be is they give you a very structured approach to asking customer questions as to whether or not the product works. So if you sell products, which are kind of physical products that can hold, the 60 decibels guide gives you the kind of questions that you should use and gives you explanations of how you should ask those questions. So the way to think about it is, when you go through an airport and you see those, when we went through airports and you had those the smiley faces with the super smiley-ish on the phone, that kind of big data gathering, 60 decibels have made more appropriate for small businesses.
Right. Okay, I'll shut up. Go ahead.
Cool. No, these are great questions, and keep firing them. Heck, that's very helpful. So what Chloe and I will talk to is we'll kind of remind you to try and get quantitative and qualitative data at each level of this of the impact framework. It's quite an important point about triangulation. So obviously, quantitative data can tell you about reach. It can tell you about the kind of aggregate of things, but qualitative data brings a lot of that to life, and that can be for any part of your impact framework. Here are some examples of data collection tools. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but what we've kind of said is we recommend that on average, most of your activity reporting should be quantitative data. It's hours of work, it's staff, it's time, it's money, it's what you're doing. Customer access often can be quantitative data. It might include social characteristics, which sometimes become qualitative. And then the rest of these are much more blended data collection types. So we'll kind of talk to these a bit more as we go through, but hopefully this is a helpful starter for you to say you don't have to go and try and capture stories about all of your activity reporting, but obviously to really bring social outcomes to life, you really need to know a little bit more about the stories of the people who are benefiting, as well as the kind of the quantitative things. So I'll be quiet about the overall framework, and I'll hand back over to Chloe, who's going to talk us through monitoring your activities and customer reach. So again, any questions, just jump in.
Cool, thanks. Okay, so this is going to be a deep dive into activity and customer access. Activity and customer access are two parts of the framework that generally do align quite nicely to each other. So you should see a follow-on from kind of your activities and what you're doing day to day to customer access and how you can measure that. So for instance, if you look at, say you ran X number of employment workshops with a vulnerable group, that would be an activity that you could measure. Then you'd also be able to say from the customer access side, this was accessed or purchased X number of times. So there's normally quite clear alignment between the two of them. But activity reporting is more day to day, what your business is doing, how many hours you spend on projects, the cost of those projects that you're running, and investment into your business. So kind of research and development on your services and the types of activities that you're providing. So it's more, as Josh said before, it's very quantitative data that you'd be collecting for that. And then on the customer access side, that's more kind of overall reach, who you're reaching, how many times your services are being accessed. In the customer access side of things, you can also look at kind of accessibility of the customer. So are you reaching a certain target demographic? are there like, is there a certain characteristic of people who are accessing your services? And that also kind of ties into the index of multiple deprivation. So you can see whether your services are being used by people from deprived areas, things like that. So it's more kind of, yeah, who you're targeting and how much your service is being accessed. And it's also important to note here that it doesn't have to be that precise. So if it seems like a lot of data is necessary and you don't necessarily have all the resources or the capacity to measure all of that, if it's going to be a big strain on you, you can calculate approximate reach through certain activities. So if on a certain project you spend X amount of time and it generally helped to support X amount of people, you can then calculate the same for similar projects. So it doesn't have to be the exact number every time, because often we find that that can put people off sometimes from even trying, because they think it's just too much for them to be able to even bother to do, because it's just so far beyond their capacity. But yeah, that's a really good way to kind of support if you have slightly less resources available.
Chloe, can I speak to this real quick? Because obviously some of the people on may have smaller teams, they may not have a social impact manager, so they may be doing all of this themselves or hiring somebody to do it that doesn't necessarily know so much about social impact. So what would be kind of like an MVP level of that? Just having a story basically and justifying those numbers based around what you just kind of calculated, that rough calculation, and multiplying it by the number of projects that you do create in reach or what have you.
If I can jump in, I would probably say, so your MVP is going to be to say, how many times did you deliver your product or service, if you can. So if your service is a workshop where people come to learn kind of MVQ level 1 equivalent of a particular skill, how many times did you deliver that workshop? And then on average, how many people come to the workshop? Because then at the very least, if you're starting to think about expanding that portfolio of work, people can kind of see whether or not you're trying to jump from, doing 100 people a year to 2,000, 3,000, 15,000. So I think what's important that, to your point around the kind of minimum viable product, Hecla, it's really to say, at the minimum, people just kind of want to know over a year, roughly speaking, or over a reasonable period, how many people have accessed your service. Because then at least you have a people can kind of understand what quantum you're operating at.
Okay.
I'd say that's the minimum one, and then everything else you add to that brings it more to life. Are you operating? I mean, very silly question. Where are you operating? So often I'll read business cases. I'm like, yeah, but where do you actually operate? Is it Glasgow? Is it Liverpool? Is it rural? You can kind of guess, but it's not always clear. So the more information you provide, the stronger the case is for why you do what you do and why it works.
Right. Okay.
But yeah.
So it's kind of just like justifying your story and telling them how you got the breakdown of where your numbers came from. Cool.
Yes. Yeah. Cool. Okay. I'll keep going if people are happy with that. I'll take silence as yes for just now.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry.
So after we've talked about, as we said, what did you do? What have your customers been able to access? The next question that's really important is customer experience. So this, the question earlier around the 60 decibels and NPS. What we really want to know is, are you helping or even hindering your customers? So what we've tried to do is on a periodic basis, we will send out a survey to a set of our investees to try and understand how the investment process has been for them. And we can ask a whole bunch of questions as to, why have you come to Big Issue Invest? Where did you find us? What did you like about the process? What could we improve? Even just having an open text box saying, what was, just have you got any ideas or general feedback? And if you find that obviously you don't want to ask every single person after every interaction, but you could, like we do, say, well, once or twice a year, you're going to do a season for asking this question. You're getting some sampled data back, or you could make it that at the end of a session twice a month, you will ask this kind of question. Some examples of this, so Chloe talked about this before, is the Net Promoter Score. You can ask much more basic questions than Net Promoter Score, just overall customer satisfaction. How would you rate it on a scale of 0 to 10? Like extremely positive, extremely poor. But the one thing you'll find is this doesn't necessarily tell you what you're doing well and what you could improve. So you might also want to add in kind of specific feedback questions. So one of the things we do is we ask questions around, was our advice suitable during the investment process? Was it clear? Were we fast? Does the financial product work? And if you build up that question set over a couple of samples, you can develop quite a rich understanding of actually where does your product really fit the needs of the beneficiaries, and where can you where can you improve essentially. So you'll find that in this we've got a link to the example of our short survey that we use, so you can copy and paste or ask questions about that after we come back to this.
Yeah, from a practicality standpoint, I know when we were working together with a couple of surveys, you can load the whole survey with a few styles of questions and just basically tick box those different categories.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so to Heckle's question, so these are all the potential options that someone could select, and all they have to do is tick a box. I'm sure everyone knows it's the least amount of writing and time you can impose upon anyone who's using your service, the better. And that's why I think it's important to think about, do you want to make sure you're asking every single person all the time, or could you take more of a sampled approach where you say, okay, well, 1 in every 10 investments or once a quarter, we will send this survey out to new customers, new beneficiaries.
Yeah, and sorry, Josh, just as an aside, a lot of the surveys, they've got some metrics as well. So be looking at the metrics, because we found out that one of the surveys that I sent out, hardly anybody was coming through it, and it was taking them 45 minutes to fill it out. Nobody's going to sit through that long of a survey. So just
absolutely
be aware of fatigue. Anyway, sorry, I'll shut up now.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And obviously we'll come to this with Chloe's point, but make sure that any questions you're asking of your investees for us investees, for you, your customers and beneficiaries, are relevant to what you're providing them. So if you're having a 5-minute interaction, you don't really there's not a lot of a mandate to have a 45-minute questionnaire. But we work with quite a few of our investees who kind of do more specialist, in-depth, these sort of therapeutic interventions where they'll have 5 or 6 or even up to 10 in-depth sessions with their beneficiaries, and that might warrant slightly more in-depth data collection given the intensity of service. So do think about the service intensity when you're thinking about the kind of questions you can answer on experience. Again, going back to my airport example, you just tap a smiley face or a sad face, obviously. So that's maybe the quickest data collection you could ever do.
There's quite a few existing, sorry Josh, there's quite a few existing as well, especially around wellbeing surveys. So you can kind of just take from existing frameworks, and then that will also, you'll be able to see kind of where you align in terms of other people's standards. So that's quite a good thing to look at. I think we've included some in the back, I believe, Josh.
Yeah. And speaking of well-being, I think sure you can segue nicely into capturing social, environmental, economic outcomes, Chloe. So I'll pass over to you now for this part.
Thanks, Josh. Okay. So this is kind of how you look at what social outcomes to measure, what social outcomes mean. And when I say social outcomes, I mean social, environmental and economic. So excuse me if I just say social. We do mean all of them. So we're looking at your outcomes. It's really important to kind of align yourself to standards. So the Sustainable Development Goals we've included here are a really good kind of worldwide standard to align yourself and look at where your outcomes and indicators can fit into this. We at Big Issue Invest look at Sustainable Development Goals when we kind of look at what outcomes we want to achieve with certain funds or with products. So we would recommend that. But you can also look at other standards and other indicators across different sectors. You can look at local needs assessment, which is kind of what priorities a certain region or locality has. So that could include activities in areas of high deprivation. And I think it's quite good to outline as well that social or environmental outcomes, they can be an increase in something. So it can be, as included kind of here in these lovely pictures, it can be an increase in kind of number of hours children are spending reading per day. Or it can be a decrease, say, in violence in a community, or it could be a maintenance, so particularly around health and well-being and housing. It can be just a sustainment of well-being is also an outcome that you can measure. And yeah, as Josh, I think, mentioned before, it's important to ensure that your outcomes measurement is proportionate to engagement. So if you have a 5-minute, say, intervention, you're realistic with what outcome you can achieve from that, compared to a really deep wellbeing intervention, like some like therapeutic services do. And it's also worth noting, I think, that a high standard for outcomes would be improvement against a baseline. So if you kind of collect data from the start of your activities, you'll be able to see where you start off and kind of how you've progressed across a certain time period. So taking wellbeing as an example, if you have a survey at the beginning of your intervention for a client, you'll see kind of where their baseline wellbeing is. There's lots of different methods for measuring wellbeing. So the wellbeing star is one of them. So it kind of measures different aspects of your wellbeing. And you can kind of see where you're at the beginning, and then after a 6-month period, you can measure it again and see where you've improved and kind of go from there. So yeah, that's outcomes. Next.
So I'm just going to interrupt again. Chloe, you talked a little bit about timeline. How often should we be checking in and out of our social impact, our theory of change? Basically these frameworks that maybe we need to move them around a little bit as we start offering more products and services?
I mean, I think, yeah, you're right. You do need to reassess where you are in a framework and kind of whether it's still relevant for you to be measuring against certain standards, because especially in our sector, standards change a lot. But I think it's also important to stick to something that works for you. So don't just change your framework every 6 months if there's something new in the market that you think people will listen to. I think the reason we say the Sustainable Development Goals are a good one to align to is because they're global. A lot more people are starting to speak that language, especially funders will want to be speaking that language if you're looking for grant funding or investment in the future. Everyone kind of is moving towards those standards, so we would really recommend you look at those. And before, they might not have been that relevant for kind of UK-based charities because they were a lot more focused on developing countries. But they are moving forwards kind of a lot in the right direction. So they're becoming a lot more helpful to a lot of UK-based charities. So yeah, I'd say, yeah, don't revisit your framework every 6 months.
Don't change your whole business to fit this framework. Yeah.
Yes, but it's good if it can help you as well, because there's a lot of indicators there that you might not have thought to measure, or yeah. So I'd say it's a good one to look at and see if it works for you. And if it doesn't work for you, then that's fine.
Thanks, Chloe.
No worries. Yeah, and then here are just some kind of other key impact variables to look at when you're thinking about what outcomes to measure. So like I mentioned before, policy alignment is quite important. So again, if you're looking for grant funding from a certain locality or region, you might want to look at what local priorities they have. So economic priorities, local kind of enterprise partnerships. And when you're looking at kind of socioeconomic outcomes, there's some standards here that show like example indicators that you can measure. So the Thriving in Places Index, for example, has lots of good data on wellbeing you can look at. NORMS has loads of labour market employability standards, and the IMD, the Index of Multiple Deprivation that we've talked about a lot, that's quite a straightforward index to use, and you can kind of see where your outcomes are. We've also listed some quite standard environmental outcome areas that you can look at. That can be if you are an environmental based organisation, so sustainability is your core product, or if you're just looking to kind of measure the environmental sustainability of your core operations in your business, because that is also a really important factor, and we're trying internally to push more towards that. And I think lots of businesses will be moving more towards these set standards in environmental standards. So yeah, they're kind of some recommendations that we make for that.
And yeah, that's, and so just for everyone, so Chloe also made the kind of helpful point as well to say it's important to try think about, first of all, when you first start working with your customer or beneficiary, what the baseline is of their particular outcome you're trying to change, and then trying to then measure the change in relation to that baseline to whether or not you help improve an outcome, help them to maintain a certain standard of living or standard achievement, or try to reduce instances of a negative happening. What we've provided here is a set of frameworks that we think are quite useful for helping to build that, because trying to go into that is a whole other set of mini development, mini podcasts or discussions. But what we provided here is a kind of a bit of a sliding scale of what's easy to use and what's kind of generalist information about that question of baselines and end lines and seeing change. Inspiring Impact have a lot of helpful methods for that, all the way through to kind of what we've deemed as the kind of slightly more complex standards. So these will be questions such as, the final one of that is the UK government's what's called Green Book Appraisal for Evaluation. And what the Green Book tries to show essentially is the kind of cost benefit for a particular type of intervention. And the question it poses is kind of a sort of social economics one, which says, have we spent the money in a efficient way to achieve the outcomes we wanted? So this is a very specialist and specific set of tools at the bottom, and at the top you'll find more general tools for you to go and explore for measuring your social outcomes. And we can, any questions on these we can go to at the end if you'd like to. So the kind of final box we talked about for your overall impact framework was your enterprise health. A lot of your enterprise health is recognizing, particularly for social organizations, that the enterprise itself often generates a lot of social benefit, either in the way that you will, for example, be a living wage certified employer, or if you have particular standards for making sure that you're being inclusive with employment practices, being B Corp Fair Trade certified, or making sure this can work for your staff members. There's actually a lot of impact is generated not just by the services, but by the way that you do business. We provided an example of a good enterprise health check. Impetus PEF have a fantastic charity outcome framework, which can be adapted for small enterprises and for social enterprises, where they try and look at how businesses perform across sort of these 10 key metrics and across a sliding scale. But what's kind of important for you to look at is to think, well, what are the things around the way we work that we think makes us socially responsible? What makes us good employers, good people to work with? And either think about measuring those or shouting about those. And it's also helpful in the same way as you think about measuring impact for your beneficiaries. You might also want to ensure that your staff members are able to fill in staff satisfaction and say what it's like to work with you, because that's obviously a question which everyone asks. So yeah, I'll stop talking to that, and I'll quickly pass on to Chloe around just talking through these different standards that are out there, if there's any particular ones we want to draw out.
Yeah, so here we've just tried to include a range of kind of industry standards for social enterprises in the social sector. There's a lot, we're aware, so don't think that you have to align to every single standard that we have included here. It's just kind of to give you an overview of some general standards, like if you want to become B Corp certified, that's a really well-renowned standard in the social enterprise sector, or become a social enterprise UK member. They're just kind of some ideas that might be useful for you to take away and look at and see if you want to become certified with any of those. And then we've tried to include some kind of specifics, so sector standard specific certifications that you can kind of align yourself to or compare yourself to or use to show where you are. So the CQC rating is more of a healthcare rating, for example, and then there's Ofsted, which I'm sure everyone knows is around education organisations. And then we've also included quite a few around the environment, which are a lot more specific, so probably would be relevant only if you were in sustainability or the environment. And then a lot around the product and supply chain, so say fair trade, like where are you getting all of your equipment from your organisation from internally in the business, not just kind of in your operations. So yeah, there's a lot to look at, but I think if you take a look at some that you think might be more relevant to you and see, that's kind of all we're kind of just throwing them out there for ideas.
Yep, and there's a good question just asked while Chloe is talking through these around B Corp certification versus KIC, and if I understood it, if they're similar. I'll just quickly answer, and if I've misunderstood, do reiterate the question. We can come back on it. Obviously, a KIC is a kind of formal incorporation, which you'll have in your articles on Companies House, whereas B Corp isn't that same level of incorporation against kind of UK Companies House. However, the B Corp standard is a very well recognized standard where essentially an independent body does an assessment of your practices and disclosures and your mission. and then you will get B Corp certification. It's a relatively long process, I would say, because you have the initial check, and then you have to come back and show that you've actually maintained against that. Funnily enough, we do have a on-purpose associate just now who's working with us, who was a B Corp assessor before she came to work with a big issue Invest. So if anyone on this call is interested in B Corp, do let Hecla or ourselves know afterwards, and we can make an introduction if you want to ask some questions. I'll very quickly just finish this off because I realize we're kind of running over, so hopefully people are happy to stay. Attached here are just some key data sources for thinking around how to collect data against standards for your social outcomes. We've included quite a lot of employment outcomes because that's what Big Issue Invest is focused on. So you'll see where to get labour market data, how to understand socioeconomic data from NOMIS, which is a UK data service, and then kind of a couple of references to other key data for the UK. I'm sure many of you already know these, but hopefully there's some useful tools just to remind you that it's not all super complex coding or costly tools. Most of the data collection tools on the left-hand side have a free version or are free, and are quite adaptable and can work for most SMEs. And on the middle and right-hand side, we've got some helpful additional frameworks that you can have a look to for gathering questions on social impact. I will leave it at that, and we'll close down in terms of us presenting, and hopefully we can come back to see everyone's faces. If people are happy to stay, we can take any questions that are left over for the last kind of 5 minutes. Otherwise, I will be quiet. Hecla, I think you're on mute.
If you want to just add your questions in the box, or feel free to, I can unmute you as well if you'd like to ask a question if it's kind of lengthy and you don't have time to type. I realize I talk a lot faster than I type as well. Also referring to the KIC question, KIC is a legal structure. You might need to be a KIC when trying to get some types of funding, whereas a B Corp, you're just a company with a certification.
Can I ask a question, Hecla?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I've heard about B Corps in the USA, but not in the UK context. And when I spoke to somebody in the US, they were saying actually a lot of the rigor around the KIC and the reporting is sometimes more rigorous than the B Corp, and a lot of people are just doing it to sort of greenwash their companies. And they're not really, it doesn't really have that much teeth. So that's why I really asked it. It's just is it worth the effort to do it as a way of, getting that tick on the box to put on your website? Yeah, how much value is it really going to add? That's all.
I think it's a really good question. And I think, for example, I know that if anyone here is interested in Scottish whiskey, and Chloe's going to roll her eyes, I've already talked about this many times, but Brewich Claddock have just done this. Yep. So Brewich Claddock are a small distillery who have just become B Corp certified. And I think it's an amazing thing that they've done, but I think it's more because that's what their customers want. And it will help them have a USP in quite obviously an incredibly competitive market, mostly taken over by people who have, a lot of heritage to the names rather than this kind of progressive approach. So I would say B Corp certification is relevant if you have a particular consumer group who align to that brand. I personally don't think that KIC is more rigorous than B Corp. Once you set it up with KIC, you have an annual reporting requirement to the KIC, but it's not in depth and it's not complex. To Companies House and the KIC register. I wouldn't say it's more difficult than B Corp. I think that the one thing I'd say for them is they have done a good job at setting some standard. I agree, though, it like any other standard, it then has a risk of greenwashing. But I wouldn't say that it's any less rigorous than the KIC standard just now. I guess, yeah. And again, if I think we've got this wonderful associate who put on her CV, she was a B Corp analyst for a couple of years. Happy to make an introduction because she'll have some more in-depth thoughts than I will on it.
Definitely. And I would also be curious to see because Anatoly has a sexual health app. So I'd be interesting to see to see how many apps are actually B Corps. I haven't come across any actually.
I would say less. It tends
You in
to be
Scotland,
more consumer. Yeah, it tends to be more consumer product facing that I can see. So yeah, but we can have a look together.
together. Does anybody
Thanks,
else
Bill.
have any questions?
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much, by the way. That was a lot of information. I just want to let you know that all of the resources I'll make available on our blog, as well as the audio from this webinar and the presentation. So don't worry if you didn't catch all of the notes that you wanted to. The information will be available. Sarah asked a question. As a part of any loan fund received from BII, can a percentage be used to pay for a member of the BII to work with the organization for a day a week to review and implement best practice social outcome? Sarah, because you are part of the Power Up Scotland program, just get in touch with me because we are offering their services out, and that's billable to BII. So, or specifically CSV, which is another subsidiary company within the biggest.
Awesome. We'll pay for it. I mean, we're in a position to pay, but in full disclosure, we don't really do this. We've been in operation for 2 years.
And do you have all of the metrics as well because you collect all of the data?
Oh, we collect a lot of data. Do we do anything with that data? No. We just create really nice files because we're graphic designers, so we store it really well. Do we utilize it? Do we maximize the value of what we're doing? Do we even create storyboards about what we're doing? No. Like, we've realized, we've come into COVID and we've realized those organizations that are getting support by different funding bodies have been amazing at maximizing the smallest social outcome.
Yeah,
Whereas
absolutely.
we're just really,
Story goes a long way, doesn't it?
yeah, and we're just like really gracefully quiet. We're just like doing our thing in the background, helping hundreds of people every day with mental health services from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. That doesn't even include like the free fitness, yoga, meditation, and qualifications we provide. And we never tell a story. And we're just really we're coming back from COVID now, having to completely revamp our social outcome metrics, the way that we convey what we do. And as much as I'd love to do it myself, I'd much prefer to pay someone else.
And so if it helps on some camaraderie on some of that needing to adapt on this, I mean, within the Big Issue magazine, we've had a huge shift in the way that we have to think about our data. So obviously Big Issue Invest, we are part of the group. Our magazine colleagues, Chloe and I, have done a lot of work with, because historically our magazine is primarily a trading-based relationship where we massively understated the additional services that our magazine staff provided. And now all of a sudden, with the lockdown of COVID, we've had to completely revamp the way we work on that and be much more proactive about those social outcomes and thinking about those additional services. So to Hecla's point, if you're on Power Up, Hecla can follow up and we can set in some time to chat about it. Chloe and I have been testing this in the fund management team, where we, as you say, we integrate the billing and the time of social impact support. But perhaps we can pick up after this.
I would absolutely pay for that if it was a percentage of the loan funding that we received, and it was allocated towards ensuring that the organisation was set up to track our social outcomes properly in the most efficient way that we possibly can. I don't think any organisation who's got sustainability in mind would mind paying for it.
Definitely.
It's good to know. It's good to know it's not a terrible idea, because obviously, as the investor, don't want to impose that. So that's a really helpful point.
No, as soon as your slides came out, I was like, I wonder how much it would cost to get you for a week.
Well, you can't have him. Like, we have him at Big Issue Invest. But sometimes it's fine.
So many organizations need this
together. He's a good chat, so you can't have him.
And we'll share these slides, and maybe Hecla, you if you're comfortable.
Yeah, I can do. Let's do an intro and have a follow-up call. Your diary times and stuff like that. So that's fine. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering about Big Issue. Do you have a way that you can sort of communicate this out about all the people you've funded and how they're reporting it out? I'm just thinking of theory of changes, outcome metrics. It'd just be useful to see how what other people are doing, how they're reporting it.
It's a very good question. So I would say a year ago we'd have a simple answer, and right now we are in transition of 3 systems just now. So we're moving from one CRM system to another, one impact framework to another, and we're also setting up a strategy at the same time. So we have boldly taken 3 initiatives at once, and that's fun. So right now we are moving away from, as Chloe said, we're moving into trying to align our investees into the SDGs. One of the reasons for that is because we also are an impact advisor on retail markets. So we advise on a social bond fund run by Columbia Threadneedle. All of those run on SDGs. And also the work we've been doing with local authorities has more of an SDG alignment to them. So that we're trying to categorize by SDG, as well as where our money is going from an index of multiple deprivation perspective. My colleague, Natalia Fernandez, I think is on, but she might be on mute the whole time, so I won't single her out. But Natalia has worked in our lending team, and they are doing some amazing work of us setting up a new database so that we can also have better data run through Salesforce, funnily enough, for tracking the kind of key characteristics of our investees. We've all recognized that in the social investment sector, there is definitely there's unequal access in terms of organizations which are BME led, disability led, quite frankly non-London led. So we're doing a lot of work to try and set that up as well. But roughly speaking, everything should go to those categories of what are we doing? We start to capture our actual activities. What's the experience of investees like yourselves? And then what are the outcomes that our investees trying to achieve? I think we steer away from us overdoing contribution and additionality analysis as an investor, because it's incredibly complex. But maybe next year, once we're in whatever the new normal is, we can come to that ambition.
I think a key takeaway here is that there's always room to grow. I think that a lot of people fare on there being this gaping hole of data that they haven't collected. And so they're reluctant to start. I've talked to a lot of our investees, particularly mine, because they're early stage and they've got their mind focused on other things, trying to run a business, trying to make money, trying to get grants, all these different things, and now coronavirus. So I think the key is to just start, make a plan and start, because for me, it's always been hard to get data out of customers, but you have to start somewhere and keep collecting it and keep gathering it. And kind of like they touched on as well, is if things are changing within your company, find a way to communicate that better within your reporting systems as well.
Exactly. Natalia is just, I think she's got a bad connection, but she just dropped a little note around the CRM. So yeah, but we'll follow up with that. Great. Thank you guys for staying on extra as well. I realize that Chloe and I slightly ran over, but hopefully there was some interesting things in there. And hopefully we'll get to meet in person one day soon.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for going through that presentation. As always, it was wonderful and super in depth. I think a lot of the other conversations we've had have been more surface level. So it's really cool to do a deep dive and really provide a lot of resource so people can do their homework later. This concludes the investment support webinar series. We are thinking about doing another series called Hey, I'm Still Here. So I'll have more information on that in the next week. According to the title, we're going to be talking to founders and how they're still surviving through this time, and what kind of key tricks they've got. Are they taking care of their mental health and well-being? That kind of thing. So yeah, stay tuned on all of our social channels. I'll get marketing tweeting that and posting on LinkedIn. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you later.
Thanks, Tekla. Bye, everyone.